So once again, welcome to the Health Tech Podcast. On the show today, we are going to be talking with Mark Long. He's the Vice President of Digital Innovation at Providence St. Joseph Health. So he oversees all the internal tech innovation at the health system, basically. Mark's team works on products that are reimagining how patients interact with their doctors and with other care providers. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. So we're going to hop in talking kind of on a big level about one of the big goals of tech innovation in healthcare, and that's basically to make the interaction and really the relationship between a patient and between their care provider smooth and easy. So tell us a bit about that. Why is that so important? How are you approaching that?
So Providence has made a shift in its thinking, and we're saying it out loud, which is we're trying to become a health company, not a healthcare company. And it sounds like a distinction, but it's a big difference, which is how do we become a partner in your health, not a place to go when you're sick, right? And so how do you get from where we are today to there? So if you think about, okay, who do I want to have as my partner in my lifelong health for myself and my family? Well, certainly you want to have somebody you trust and you have a great relationship with. And people tend to have a very great relationship with an individual doctor, often their primary care doc, but the system as a whole is often clunky and difficult to deal with. Mm-hmm. And so what I say today is, would you want to have a relationship with somebody who poked you in the eye every time you ran into them? Of course not. But let's be honest. Getting an appointment, you call up a specialist, you beg and plead, it takes 2 or 3 months, you show up, they give you a clipboard in the waiting room and they say, fill this out. And then you ask the same questions they asked you last time and you go into the room and they ignore what you wrote and they ask you again. It's not really a comfortable, like, hey, this is a person I want to have a relationship with. Once you get to the doctor, that's great. But the rest of the system is often a little challenging. So we say if we really want to get to the point where we're your partner for yourself and your family, we need to be able to create that relationship. And we need to deserve and earn the right for that relationship. And the first thing we have to do is get the transactions to be easier. Right? And so that's where we're really starting with is help me find the doc, help me schedule the doc, give me access, convenience, choice, take away the clipboard, help me understand my insurance registration. So we're doing a lot of those basics, but with a long-term goal of really driving toward a trusted relationship where you can partner in your health, not just a commodity to call when you're having a sickness.
Because it seems like as you're engaging with your primary care physician or a specialist, a lot of times getting the appointment, getting into the office is a huge hurdle. It can be weeks or months away.
Right.
It can be at an inconvenient time. Right. So it seems like there's a huge role there for technology to step in and provide an initial interaction that can perhaps even solve a big part of the problem.
Right, absolutely. And one of the things that we talk about is the right care at the right time at the right venue. And so that's really one of the big things we're working on is expanding the choice. For 40 years, we've trained people. Healthcare is 2 things. It's your primary care doc or it's the emergency department, right, or the emergency room. So now we have all these choices. Still, if you go, urgent care has been around for a long time, and you ask people, what is urgent care? They're like, I don't really know, right? My parents are like, in Pennsylvania, they're like, well, something's going on Friday night. Let's just go to the urgent care. No, I don't really understand what that is, right? And so we're getting there, but now we have urgent care. We have retail clinics inside of Walgreens or walk-in clinics. We have virtual visits you can do on your phone. We're piloting at home. So now there's expanded choices. The people don't really understand, okay, well, when do I go to which one, and is it covered, and what's my copay? So we have a lot of work to do as we're expanding choice to really try and educate folks what's the right venue for them.
So let's lay a foundation of exactly what you're doing at Providence.
Right.
If I'm in the system, going to a Providence provider, what as a patient can I do on my phone, on my tablet, on my computer? How can I interact with the system and my primary care provider or someone else through your apps?
Right. So right now we have a lot of choice, and we're driving toward a consolidated experience. But you think about what are my choices, depending on your health plan. So through Providence Health Plan, if you're a health plan member, we have a nurse helpline. If you go into our app, you can do a virtual visit, right? And that's video through your laptop or your phone. You can meet with a nurse practitioner. We've got Express Care, which some are walk-in clinics and some are inside of a Walgreens or another retail site. We've got urgent care sites. We've got primary care docs. We've got emergency rooms. So right there, you have 7 or 8 different choices for care. right? And many of those were starting to drive toward a consolidated experience, and internally we call it this get care now. Just help me understand my choices, help me decide which one's right for me, and if a virtual visit, just let me do it on my phone right now. If it's somebody you can send to my home, right? Let me just drop the pin like I do with Uber, tell you where I am and when you're going to be there, right? Or show me the nearest walk-in clinic and show me what the appointments are available, and just say, oh, it's 1.2 miles away on a map. Here's the pin, 8 o'clock, great, I'm there. So it's really providing that kind of ease of understanding of the options and choice.
So you're bringing back the house call in
Absolutely.
an Uber
Yeah.
style.
Yeah.
So how much uptake are you seeing of this? At what stage of the rollout are you? Is this more experimental at this point, or is this full-blown in the system?
This is absolutely experimental. So we started with full-blown MDs. The next step was, let's do it with nurse practitioners, right? And it's really trying to understand the demand in the market. And it runs the full gamut from somebody who's about to go on an international business trip that needs to be seen in their office to somebody we've seen folks who haven't been out of their house in years, right? Which is obviously a serious issue. But again, it's providing a level of access and choice that wasn't been there before. So we're really in the early experimental stage in parts of Los Angeles and parts of downtown Seattle. And so we're really just trying to learn and understand the market. But we really see this as a huge opportunity over time, and we'll get to telehealth in a second, but if you can imagine over time, say we go from an MD to a nurse practitioner and maybe send an MA to your house, right, a medical assistant. Well, that person can then beam in through telehealth. Well, maybe you need a social worker. Well, maybe you need a cardiologist, right? So it's really difficult to send all of those specialists to your house. But over time, we can really make them available through telehealth. And again, I'm talking over the years, right? We're really in the early experimental stage to get the logistics worked out, to understand the market.
How much appetite is there among consumers, among patients for this? Or do you see people actually wanting to do it? Or is it, are the people stuck in the old model as well? Are the patients stuck in the old model?
And it's great you said that. Aaron, our chief digital officer, talks about adoption triggers. And what we see both with the at-home and also with our virtual visits, which is video over your phone, is the people who use it love it. I mean, the NPS scores are off the charts. The 85% of virtual visits say, it's better, equal or better than being in person. What we're having trouble with is getting people to try it. So it's that little adoption clip. Well, what is it, and can you really do it? And people are a little skeptical, like, well, don't I need to be there with all the instrumentation, or there for you to kind of look in my ears in person, right? And so many of the things, medically, you don't need to be there in person, or it's fine to have somebody come to your house without all of the machinery. It's really helping people to understand these different choices and get them comfortable. That's really the challenge, right? And it's a marketing challenge, it's an experiential challenge, it's an education challenge.
So you mentioned a few times the complexity of all those many choices.
Right.
How much can tech play a role in kind of guiding people, and how much of it needs to be handled by, say, a nurse practitioner or someone with a more in-depth knowledge of medicine?
Yeah, it's all the above, right? So it's, and I don't remember the exact stats, but something like 80% of all medical encounters start with Google, right? That's just a fact, right? And so it's through traditional e-commerce digital marketing channels that we educate and inform of the choices, right? It may not be sufficient to get to the final transaction for some, and others it may be. But it's also really that trusted relationship with a person's primary care or care provider that's a really a big differentiator, because that's the person, look, you've been going to for years, or maybe you haven't been, but you've got a trusted relationship and you're really looking for somebody who's an expert in the field to give you counsel. So it really has to come from both sides of the equation to help over time. Again, for 40 years, we've taught people primary care and emergency room. Now we're really in this education phase to really introduce people to these new options and help them understand and get comfortable with them.
And what do you think is the role of, say, Providence doing that for the patients that it has versus, say, local or state government or other bodies, public health officials? Like, right. How do those forces all work together to help bring that education?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it depends on the segment, right? And so different people have exposure to these different entities, whether it's through public health in campaigns that say, hey, these things are available, and that some of that might be through Medicaid or Medicare. Other times it might be through a provider like Providence or an insurer, right? And saying, look, here are some options, and here's what we can recommend or provide for you as choices. So I think it's all the above. I don't think we should leave any stone left unturned, because there's a lot of different market segments that are getting their information and education from a lot of different places.
If you're just joining us on the live stream, we are live at Providence St. Joseph Health. We're here with Mark Long. He is the Senior Vice President of Digital Innovation here. He's also a veteran of Amazon and NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, which we'll maybe get to a little bit later.
Happy to.
Mark, Claire and I were having a discussion as we were preparing for the show about the definition of telehealth and telemedicine. Right. How do you define it, and can you describe the current state of the art, where the health industry is overall as it relates to telehealth, getting this kind of care or guidance over a smartphone or a phone?
Yeah. So in terms of definition, I mean, that's one of those black holes you could get into. Some people would say, gee, I had an email with my provider. That's telehealth. Okay. And some people agree with that. Some people don't. Other people say things like remote monitoring. So maybe I sent wired an IoT kind of device with you at home after surgery to monitor blood pressure or whatever. And that's telemedicine. And in some cases it is. Traditionally, what we think about, or I should say myself, it's really, am I having an encounter with a medical professional in real time over video? That's kind of when thinks of people think of television and telehealth. So that really comes in a broad spectrum of flavors. On the kind of what we call the low acuity side, it's, hey, I'm going to do an express care virtual visit. I have a respiratory infection, or I don't know if I have a cold or a flu. Do I need antibiotics or don't I need it? Or, my classic example is, I get the same ear infection every 6 months. I don't need to take a half a day off work and try and find an appointment and go and sit in the waiting room and pay $10 for parking. Just look at my record, send the antibiotics down to the corner drugstore. I'm done in 17 minutes, right? And so there's those kinds of convenient side of things. On the other side, you have the true high acuity. So the classic is telestroke, right? You're in a small hospital, or even in a large hospital, and there doesn't happen to be a vascular neurologist on staff when you come into the emergency room with a stroke. That's critical. Minutes matter, right? As our neurologist friends say, seconds are brain, right? Because you're really losing brain. So that's another case where we've kind of beamed in through video and through camera and remote camera controls that vascular neurologist to be the partner with the emergency room physician to kind of diagnose that patient and figure out the course of treatment. So it really spans the spectrum, and then there's many in the middle of the different acuity stages.
And when you look at the industry overall, what are the key next steps to increase adoption, to improve the experience? If you could snap your fingers, wave a magic wand, and solve 2 or 3 problems, what would they be?
So I'll point to 2, and they're kind of very, very different, right? And so it's in this day and age, anybody who's tried to use a lot of Link or even Skype, and we've done some experiments with other kind of consumer grade video, and everybody says, why don't you use X, Y, and Z, right? Because it's on everybody's phones. They're actually not that reliable when you're actually trying to do an appointment, even a low acuity appointment where it's just about the sniffles. And you're like, we've had failure rates of 30, 40, 50%. And it's like, wait a second, this is just something we all have. It comes for free on our phone. Why doesn't it just work? But in an enterprise or in a medical context, you really need a much higher level of reliability, right? And especially when you're in kind of a situation where it's a little bit tense. I don't know about you, but I use Blink 7 times a day, right? And I get the little pop-up. It says, sorry, your computer's causing problems, and you're getting the voice going in and out. That's not so great when you're having a medical encounter and you can't really hear the doc or the doc can't hear you. So that kind of technical backbone, reliability, and it's not just the end software, but it's all the networks and, about firewall hops and VPNs and all that kind of stuff. So I think we have another kind of almost order magnitude or factor of 2 to 5 to really get the reliability and the quality up. So it's really just a utility. The second piece of it is completely different. It's all about cultural adoption and understanding and people's comfort level. And it goes back to that adoption trigger. How do we get people to try these things so they really kind of understand, okay, well, this is actually better. And one of the kind of interesting, unique things we found out with virtual visits was people feel actually a higher level of engagement with their provider over video than in person. And first, I was like, well,
Really?
that's really bizarre.
That is surprising.
Right? So sit there when you think about you're in the clinic room, your doctor's sitting there looking at you, typing in the EHR, looking at you, typing your medical records. In the video, they're looking at you 100% of the time because the camera's focused on them, they're looking at you, and they're up close, and there's a very intimate kind of personal engagement going on. And they might be typing, but they're looking at you nonstop. And it's a very interesting, very counterintuitive thing. But many of our patients are saying this was really fantastic. I felt heard. I felt listened to. The person was looking at me, 98% of the time instead of 70% of the time.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that, and so as over time, to your question, is as people to get level of comfort to say, if I just have a respiratory infection or an earache or a flu, video is really fine. And so that's kind of the next big quantum leap there is people's comfort. And it's not just on the patient side. The same thing goes for one of the experiments we're running is doctors having follow-up. So say you have some sort of chronic condition, you need to check in with your primary care doc every 3 months. How the bed's going, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at your test results. Could every other one of those visits be via video? Mm-hmm. More convenient for you, potentially lower cost, more convenient for the doc, right? But again, it's one of those, it's a big change in the relationship between the doc and the patient. So both sides, we need to kind of get to a level of comfort.
I'm really curious about how these kinds of systems address the potential of missed diagnoses. In other words, you used your ear infection example earlier. What if that annual ear infection that you get next year is actually something more serious than you had last year,
Right.
different cause,
Right.
different illness, different ailment?
Right.
How does the system deal with that in the telehealth scenario?
Yeah, I think it's, and that's one of those things that we're learning. And so I'm not an MD. I'm not going to, comment on these things. But what I've heard from the experts is that access to care actually is vastly more important than some of these issues about maybe not being there in person. And so the trade-off is maybe not, hey, you were there in person and I might have caught something in that 1% of the time, but think of the 20 or 30% of the time somebody didn't seek care because it was inconvenient or they didn't have access. So if you look at the overall population, there is this trade-off. But it's certainly, to your point, one of the things we're learning about, okay, well, how does somebody work over video, over telehealth that's different? So we had an actual example of somebody who came in and couldn't get an appointment with a live primary care doc, right? The wife had heard about it and said, okay, let's do this video thing. And the person had been not feeling well for a long time. Turned out through questioning that they had a more serious condition. The nurse practitioner says, well, why don't you go into the ER and get a test run? Turned out they had a very serious problem that had it been delayed for weeks or months would have turned into a lot more serious, and that person caught it. So there is a unique skill and talent to being a medical provider over telehealth that allows them to really so when you really think about it, is it all about hands-on or looking in your ear, or is it about kind of this skill of understanding the person, asking the right questions, diving deeper? It's really both.
Good question here from the live video on Facebook. Hello, everyone. From Nick Holmes, what is the acceptance rate from physicians that would rather see patients virtually than in person? So, what do physicians prefer, and would they rather do one or the other in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think many physicians. And I can't really speak for physicians, right? I'm a tech guy. I'm a lifelong engineer, and so all I can really talk about is some anecdotal experience. So I think many physicians like the classic interaction because they like to be in the room with the patient. I think over time, some of the things we talked about, maybe chronic condition check-in and follow-up, there's a convenience factor that physicians will start to understand and enjoy and like that flexibility in their schedule. I think for now, many of them are very comfortable with kind of the traditional setting because they know and understand it, right? And I think that's something that's on us as technologists to help create that 10x better experience, that digital experience, not only for the patients, but for the providers as well. So
we're talking a lot about smartphones and the whole idea of maybe doing a Skype call with the doctor on a tablet. What about voice assistants, though? Could I have Alexa diagnose my ear infection at some point?
Well,
or her medical counterpart.
Yeah, it's actually something we're playing with. It's not even in. I wouldn't even. It was like pre-experimental. This is really in our hackathons that we're playing around with, whether it's Alexa or whether it's a bot. And so voice is great and bots are great. So it really comes back to that AI and the decision tree engine behind the scenes, right? And there's a lot of work by a lot of startups and a lot of other organizations trying to. It's essentially causing a triage problem. Right? How do I understand what is the right care for me? Right? And so there's a lot of people working on this problem. And to be honest, I don't think it's that far away. I met somebody at a conference 2 years ago, and they were a startup. And unlike traditional telehealth, which you just beam in and I'm going to start a video encounter, they started with text. And then if they couldn't solve, and again, this was a person, but if they couldn't solve that interaction via text, they said, well, can you pick up the phone? And then if they couldn't solve it, then they picked up video. 50% were resolved text only, 30% needed phone, and the last 20% needed video. Well, what do we know about assistants? They all get smarter with data. So even if it's a human being that's driving that text interaction or the voice interaction over phone, and we collect that data over a long period of time, we're going to get a lot smarter. Right, so this is the beginning of a journey which allows us to collect that data and that smarts and intelligence. So the infrastructure is there. Now it's really about putting that data together and driving to that level of reliability that we're all comfortable with, really, when it comes to our health. That's different than a shopping experience.
Two more great questions on the live stream that actually segue into something that I was hoping to talk about, and that is the great topic of insurance. Both Howard Tingley and Mark Simpson have related questions on this. Yeah. First, Howard has my question. This was the one I was going to ask. How are you reimbursed for a virtual visit from insurance or government payers, and how do health insurers look at this whole thing if you're not actually going into the physical office?
Yes, it is. Again, we're in the early days of a transition. Many and we're working with insurers and payers. It's part of what we do, is to help them understand and provide the data over time, which says, look, we've provided care and access to people either who wouldn't have it or would have gone to maybe a more expensive venue. And so really it's incumbent up on a partnership that over time. So we do have many insurers who do reimburse virtual visits. We're working with government entities. In Oregon, we've got pieces of Medicaid that are now reimbursing virtual visits, and so it's like anything in medicine, right? You want to have your diligence, and you want to have kind of the data behind it to say we're doing the right thing for the patients, but also, and again, this is where I'm not an expert on the insurance side. They also don't want to open the floodgates on something that's unproven, and all of a sudden say, hey, we're just going to blank and cover this, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to respect both sides of it and provide the data with them over time. And we're on that march. And that's one of the reasons why it's not just, hey, let's flip the switch and all of a sudden all of America has, half price video visits, right? Yes. Because we really need to be responsible and collect that data.
So if you look, I know a lot of this is still in the very early ages, but 10, 15 years down the line, after the initial investment has been made in all the technology we're talking about, do you believe that this would lower the overall cost of healthcare? It would be one way to do that.
So not only do I hope that'll lower the overall cost of healthcare, and I'm very confident in that, because this whole idea of getting you to the right venue of care. So our data basically says over half of the people who come into our emergency room don't have something severe enough to warrant being in the emergency room. That's a massive cost for our country to be seeing those folks, right? And so what we need to do is provide them alternatives and then help them get a comfort level with those alternatives that they can actually meet their needs. And that works all the way up the chains from something in an emergency room up to, the sore throat in the earache. So we would absolutely be able to lower the cost, but I would go one step further, which is I think by having these other venues that are more convenient, we can create a higher level of engagement, which drives toward what we started this conversation with, which is let's get out of the transaction mode and get into more of the relationship mode, and let's be your partner in health, which will even further dramatically reduce the cost for our country in healthcare. So,
Mark Simpson has the other side of the insurance question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to address this, but he wants to know, how would liability insurers for physicians react to this whole idea?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment.
And then Nick has one more question.
Yeah.
We're getting great questions from Facebook, so I want to be sure to ask him. What's your approach to increase physician adoption rates to use technology when traditionally most physicians will not use it when a sheet of paper is easier and faster for them?
Right.
Seems like paper would be a big competition.
Well, paper is a competition. I think there's a couple different things going on, which is certainly you have to demonstrate the value, right? And so what we call that is looking for the champions. So we find those early adopters who are willing to kind of take a risk and put energy because they're passionate about it, or some docs just love technology, and really demonstrate the win, right? And so earn the right for that next segment. It's not like any adoption curve, right? In technology, there's the early adopters, there's the next phase. And so we're really kind of in that kind of, the second half of that early adopter phase. And now we're kind of trying to get into the mainstream and say, look, we've proven this out and we're trying to scale this thing, and we're bringing the evidence from those early wins to that next tranche of doctors, right?
Yeah, I actually have a really important follow-up question to that have you or do you foresee an invention that could translate the doctor's writing? In other words, natural language processing of a doctor's writing on a prescription?
Well, so the number of docs doing handwritten prescription pad is on the dramatic decrease.
Is it? Okay,
right?
Good. My doctor still does.
It does.
I can barely read her writing.
Okay.
I had to interpret it for the pharmacy last time.
Well, there are many tools around e-prescribing and what's called the physician order entry systems that are doing that, and that's not just for the writing, but it's so they can cross-check: is this the right thing, or are there any complications with other meds? But to your point, there actually are. In fact, I read a blog post just in the last couple of days about a startup that's working on a voice assistant to allow the doc to dictate.
Right.
So again,
Sakara, possibly.
Yeah, you probably read Claire's story.
Probably right. Probably your story. Yes. Right. But it's something we played around again with hackathons, and the voice is getting good enough there. And even though medical language is complicated, it's a controlled vocabulary, right? So hopefully between the two of those things, we can get to a point, and that'll really aid the physician experience with the patient to try and help that.
While we're on the topic of AI and voice processing, you worked at a startup called Zinx, is that correct?
Zinx Health,
Yeah, and you worked on natural language processing, I believe related to the physician side of things. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Zinx Health is in the business of what's called evidence-based order sets. So say you're with your physician and you have congestive heart failure. So up comes this thing called an order entry screen, which says, okay, well, what tests do I need? What meds do I need? And rather than it being a blank screen, what Zinx has done is scoured all of the medical literature and said, here's the latest, greatest thinking about what you should do for the treatment for any number of conditions. And it's pre-populated with the right things to do. Now, it's not cookbook medicine, right? The doc still goes in and says, yes, this applies to my patient. No, for these other reasons. But it kind of pre-populates all those things. And one of the big challenges we had in that situation, which was every hospital uses a slightly different set of terminology. So you might say EKG, you might say electrocardiogram, I might say 12L, ECG.
Right.
And so what we used the NLP for is we had thousands of hospitals' medical vocabularies in our systems. And so we used the NLP to kind of scrape the evidence and say, I'm looking for this term. And then I was able to match across all of our customers what they were using the different terms for and actually do those vocabulary mappings.
Yeah.
And so we could go look in their database for maybe things that are a little slightly bit out of date and suggest updates for them in addition to mapping the terminology. So that was the machine learning NLP application we had. Got it.
I'd like to circle back to one thing. You mentioned the issues with the infrastructure with just off the shelf third-party applications like Skype or FaceTime. How much can you rely on those common apps for these kinds of situations and scenarios versus coding your own? Where do you come down on that?
Well, we're going with WebRTC, right? And so that's kind of started by Google, but it has enough openness so you can actually get the metrics that's showing you in real time what's going on with the data stream and what the dropout rates are and what your bit rates are. So it allows you to both have a stable infrastructure that's used by literally hundreds of millions of people and a lot of people are working on, but it also has the instrumentation, unlike many commercial products, to really see what's going on in real time and build some of that extra robustness around it you might not have in a commercial product.
Yeah, good. Tell us more about yourself. As we teased earlier, you have worked at Amazon. You were at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab.
Yeah.
You have a really interesting history. How did you get to this spot? And what's your interest in health and healthcare? And tell us more about your story.
Yeah, well, I guess I always look for, and again, it's an overused word, but I always look for impact, right? So while I'm an engineer at heart and I like designing systems, I really like designing systems that'll move a needle. So my first job was I was lucky enough to get a job at NASA JPL. I was in space robotics in the research group, and we were working on how do you run robots on orbit for satellite servicing, for the space station? How do you control robots from the ground under time delay? And so it was an R&D group, and it was a lot of fun because we were in the lab playing around with stuff. And that really kind of, from a mechanical engineer to a software guy, right? I always say robots are 10% math and 90% software.
Yeah.
Really kind of spending a lot more time about software, but also algorithms, and we were doing, 3D graphics and in some ways we talk about telehealth. Big thing in those days was telerobotics. So how do you control the robot remotely? And so
on Mars.
On Mars, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
With time delay. Yeah. If you think getting into the doctor's office is difficult, try getting onto Mars.
Try getting onto Mars, right? And try picking up a rock in Mars without
exactly.
After a number of years there, I was actually very much influenced by we had a visiting professor at Caltech who had come from industry and taught a bunch of classes on technology strategy and product management. And I had never even heard. I'd never met an MBA. Maybe I met one, but I didn't. NASA doesn't, don't tout MBAs. And this guy was talking about product strategy and what is this product stuff and what is this technology strategy. And I was really intrigued by this whole idea of really thinking about kind of the strategy of this. And this was 1999. It was the dot-com boom. In Pasadena was Idea Lab that had 25 startups in a warehouse. And I said, I can really go learn about this stuff in a completely new way. And so I went to a startup at Idea Lab called paymybills.com, which was online banking before there was online banking. And it was just absolute craziness. I was employee number 23. In 6 months, we were at 200. 6 months later, we were sold. And 6 months later, we were shut down, right? But it truly was learned by doing everything wrong. It was just a bunch of guys thrown in a room, and we were just hacking like crazy to keep these systems up. So it was a great learning experience. But that was really my transition to the commercial sector, and from there I went to another startup that was in the B2B space, and then from there I went to Zinx Health, which was an established player but was looking to kind of strengthen its technology a little bit, and those last two companies were really where I got more and more exposure to healthcare.
And then you worked in logistics at Amazon.
Yes. So I was looking for a little bit of a change.
No kidding.
Yes. And I was deciding between a healthcare startup in Los Angeles and Amazon in Seattle. And I said, well, I've done the healthcare thing. I understand it from a healthcare vendor side. I said, let me just jump into some craziness and try something completely new. And how many times, when you talk about the big dogs of Amazon or Google, and just like it's an experience you want to have. And so that was a vast, interesting learning experience just to think about the scale and the way they think.
Is there anything you learned in logistics at Amazon? Because they are the masters of logistics.
Yes.
That you apply to telehealth or your current role, or their principles of connecting with folks?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, logistics aside, I think if you and everybody talks about kind of the Amazon leadership principles, I think they're a really great statement of things to think about in terms of building a culture of an organization. And so I think being there inside and kind of living it and seeing it real firsthand was just a great learning experience. The interesting thing about many of the logistics things we were working at the time was it's a lot about data. So two quick examples. So the way the zip codes are laid out in China is kind of really interesting. And so you might have parts of Beijing which are in the same zip code and accessible by a 1 hour delivery that are different than the same zip code that might take you 3 hours to deliver. So in terms of Amazon making a delivery promise when somebody's ordering, the zip code was really not enough. And so really, when you think about UPS or FedEx or Amazon, a lot of these logistic companies are data companies. I was literally in the UK the Sunday before Christmas on a truck delivering packages, and we were looking for an address called Piper Cottage, Milton Keynes, That was it. That was the entire, right? And we're driving around, there's no streets, there's no numbers, and we're asking people, and they were like, where's Piper College? Well, it's around that alley behind that bush. And like, well, the woman's like, I've been here 100 years. How do you not know where Piper Cottage is, right? So, but that's the data of the logistics, right? So there's all this other machinery, but really that data that these large companies have learned over time allow them not only to pinpoint the delivery, to plan the routes, but also to make the promise to say, am I really going to deliver this tomorrow, or is it a 2 or 3 day delivery?
So you're at the beginnings of those stages in healthcare,
right?
Getting all the data to be able to
have
deliver services with certainty.
And if there's anything I talk about over and over again in healthcare, the absolute most important thing we need to do is this idea of data liquidity between all of our siloed systems, so that over time we can bring all this data together. And whether it's personalization for you about an application that we can be your partner in health, or whether it's a surveillance system that'll predict somebody leaving the hospital that really shouldn't, right? And it really comes from that data as a starting point.
So before we have one more segment we want to get to, but before we move on, last question for you. I'm wondering what your biggest aha moment has been so far, interacting with like a doctor or a patient, where you said, yes, that experience is what we are trying to do and what this is all about.
Yeah, I'll give you two, right? One was personal and one was secondhand, right? So my personal one was just the convenience, right? And this is going to sound trivial, but the idea that I wasn't feeling well and I kind of put it off, and I said, well, I've got a lot of stuff going on at work. And finally it's Saturday at 5 o'clock, and I'm like, I felt like crap for 3 or 4 days, right? And normally you're like, okay, well, I'll tough it out, right? But I pulled up my app and I found a local express care site that was, 2 miles away. It was inside of a Walgreens, and I had a 7 o'clock appointment, and I pressed the button. I got in my car and I drove and saw the person and got my issue taken care of. And I was like, oh my God, right? Because you normally think about healthcare as something you do everything you can to put off dealing with, right? Because just the transactions of it are so difficult. The second one was actually with an interview we were doing with some product kind of hypothesis testing we were doing. And it was really this whole idea we talked about of, how do I understand my options and make a choice? And this person's spouse was on an international trip, came back, was really sick for 2 days. And Friday it's 10 o'clock, and they're like, oh my God, this person's not getting better. And through that interview and several interviews like it, two big ahas we had, which is people tend to defer their own care, and they tend to be hypersensitive to the care of their children and their parents. Right, so they tend to overreact but when it comes to themselves, they tend to underreact, which is really interesting. The second bigger aha moment, which is this whole idea that we're going to expect our patients to self-triage, and it's Friday night at 10, your spouse has been, really, really sick in graphic ways for 48 hours. At that moment, we want you to understand the difference between emergency room and urgent care and express care and video. That's not a realistic thing for us to ask our patients to do. So we need to do a much better job, not only in the moment, but also for the training or the education of the system for the months and years ahead of time, so that when you're in that moment, you understand, you say, okay, urgent care, this is an urgent care thing, I'm going to go. Or, I can really pick up the nurse helpline and have this taken care of. And so it's both an in-the-moment education thing, but it's also us training people over time what these different options are, and so they can understand. And that's a challenge, right? It's beyond the technology of just building it.
Great. So we are here, if you're watching on the live stream, we're speaking with Mark Long. He's the Senior Vice President of Digital Innovation at Providence St. Joseph Health. And as many of you know, if you're fans of the podcast, we've got lots of listeners out there. And if you don't subscribe, by the way, you can go to geekwire.com/healthtech to find all the past episodes of the podcast. But we like to end with a segment that we call The Fix.
Okay.
You've heard every, I know you've listened to every episode,
Absolutely.
Mark,
Yes.
so you're totally familiar with this whole concept. So Claire, why don't you set this up, and we can vamp a little bit if Mark needs to think about it a little bit.
Sure thing. So since you're in this world so often, we wanted to ask about something, and we ask all our guests this, not just you, don't worry. Something that you're not working on, so kind of outside that telehealth realm, that you think is really important, that's a really big problem that needs to be dealt with. And this could be something you've experienced in your personal life or in your professional life that you just aren't working on or haven't gotten around to working on yet. And you don't have to have an actual fix ready to go,
Right.
but what's the gap
Right.
that needs to be filled?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit because this is sort of telehealth, but it's not telehealth in the realm we talked about.
Okay.
So between the time I got this job offer and I started, and I was talking to a lot of friends and colleagues, I was like, oh, I got this new job and here's the stuff we're working on. Literally 80% of the people, when you use the word telehealth, they said, you know what I want? I want to be in the room with my family member, most often an aging parent who's in a different state.
Oh, I know what the fix is to this, but I don't want to. I don't want to solve it for you.
But it's an easy. It's in some ways technologically it's an easy thing to do. But if you dig down a level or two, the core thing is I need better transparency into what's going on with my family members. But I need transparency not just in terms of access to the patient portal, but I want to be there and treated like a family, not an individual person. And so this whole idea, and I joke sometimes, we think of healthcare as your physical you and only you. And we put you in a room by yourself and talk about your physical health. Well, what about your mental health? And why isn't that together, right? So Providence is very dedicated to whole person care. Well, what about the health of you and your family together? Because you're all working together, and a lot of times your family, especially in chronic situations, your conditions are related to those of your family, right? Because you're acting as a family unit in the same habits and the same
and
what
the same
about
genes.
and the same genes and
Yes.
your extended family with your parents and your children. So really, while it might sound simple as, hey, I just want to be in the room on the phone so I can ask the docs questions and interpret for my parents, it really is much deeper in terms of I want to be treated as a family unit and understand what's going on with my health and the health of those I care about.
What's the fix for that?
And it's a lot of little things, right? So it's part technology. It's better patient portals, which give you delicate access to your family members, right? Which we're working on today and we have a lot of. And it's expanding that information that's in those portals. So when, my mom's oxygen was ordered, I know it was ordered and I know it's going to show up even though it's 3,000 miles away in Pennsylvania. It is allowing me to be in the room with the specialist when they're having the conversation. And I could be there in video or maybe even see kind of the lab results to be even better. But then it's over time having the healthcare establishment also treat us as a family unit, right? And really start to say, okay, we're a partner in this together, right? And so there's two sides of the coin. One is technological, but B, it's kind of, it's a change in the way we think about interacting with individuals, but, and their families.
I can't believe we didn't talk about this during the main segment. It was on my list, but I didn't get to it. What about virtual and augmented reality to solve that problem?
Yes.
Could I put on my HoloLens and see be in the room and see my mom's physician standing there with her standing there talking to him?
Absolutely.
How far off is that?
Well, I think with that one, I think the real question is what's don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And the good is let me see the records, let me see the lab results, and let me be on audio or video in the room, right? The fancy, the 5-year, the 10-year solution might be the VR helmet when we all have VR helmets, right? There's a very small number of us who do. But I think we need to kind of march our way there, right? So,
Okay.
A small tangent related to what you were talking about, genetics. How much do you see genetics playing a role in healthcare?
Yeah, it's absolutely huge, right? So a couple, thoughts to stitch together. One is we've recently affiliated with an organization called Institute for Systems Biology, which is one of the founding research in genetics. Lee Hood's phenomenal work, and they're doing a pilot with many of the employees here on something called AirVale, which has both your genetics and coaching together. Huge possibility. But another interesting tidbit from my past when I was working at Zincs Health and we had all this evidence-based medicine and people were saying, well, gee, is it cookbook? Are you taking decisions away? One of the things that we heard over and over again from docs was any doc who went through, finished med school, 2000, 2005. Prior to that, there was this idea that you could keep the medical knowledge in your head. Around that time, something changed with the proteomics and genomics, where basically physicians were so overwhelmed by this information. They said, I accept the fact that I can't keep all this in my head, and there's so much complexity here that I'm going to really need to rely on some of these more advanced tools to be my partner in certain things that I do, right? And so I happen to have my little brother works for one of the large pharmaceutical companies, and so we talk about personalized medicine, and they're working on things like that. And how do I take your genetics into account when I'm choosing a med for you to take and things like that? And so it's absolutely critical that we get there, right? Again, it's going to rely on a lot more data, a lot more intelligence, a lot more connectedness, all the things we're working on that are putting the foundational pieces in place.
Yeah. Well, Mark Long, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. This has been fun. Went by really fast.
It's been a lot of fun. And thanks to everybody on the live stream. Great questions. We're going to be doing one more of these live streams as part of our first season of the GeekWire Health Tech Podcast, which is sponsored by Providence St. Joseph Health. If you want to subscribe, don't forget to go to geekwire.com/healthtech. To follow Providence, you can follow them at Prov Innovation on Twitter. And I think that's it. Anything else you wanted to add, Mark? What's the best way for folks to follow you? Are you on Twitter?
I'm not on Twitter. No,
Okay.
You can poke in LinkedIn or
LinkedIn.
yes,
There
right,
you go.
or-
LinkedIn.
yes,
I was
right,
just
yes.
looking at your LinkedIn profile. It looks
Yeah.
like you're very active there.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Until next time, I'm Todd Bishop.
And I'm Claire McGrain.
We'll talk to you next time on GeekWire. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.